Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the free training Thursday. Things to know about the QuickBooks Sync. This is going to be fun. We're going to discuss some of the basics of the sync itself, some things to keep in mind, kind of go through that. Before we get started here, I do want to remind you, if you do have questions, please feel free to toss those into the questions section. That way I can get to them. I'm going to try to get through our content here pretty quickly. That way we can make sure that we get to any questions that are asked. If they're too personal, meaning too direct to maybe your individual situation, or you're having an issue with something, we may need to schedule that offline. So just keep that in mind. If you're saying something's not working or something's not pushing the way that you think, I'll try my best to answer it. But if I can't, then again, we may need to take that offline. So basically, I only have a few slides for you today, not too much. Here's basically what we're going to be covering. Pre-sync tips, some things to keep in mind before you start the sync, some things to understand about the QuickBooks Sync itself, just getting you guys up to speed. Actual syncing tips, getting through actually processing the sync tool and getting things sent over. What should you send over? How should it go over? How can you expect it to go over? And then a few additional best practices, post-sync information about the QuickBooks Sync and how it connects to OfficeTools. And that's really it. That's going to take up a lot of our time, and hopefully you guys are able to get some questions in there and we can make sure that this is beneficial. So if you do have any additional questions or you need anything else, please visit us, abacusnext.com/support. You can schedule training there. You can schedule support sessions, get our phone numbers, get our contact information. And then you can also sign up for any upcoming webinars. We're changing our style a little bit, so be prepared for that. We're not really going to be focusing on free training anymore. It's going to be more hour-long sessions to cover specific topics. So keep in mind and look out for the new updated changes. They're going to be really great. We're going to be just having a lot more questions and answers, topics that are a little bit more expansive, not so rushed. So we're changing some of that style. So keep that on the forefront. Keep a weather eye out for that, and you guys should be surprised at what we've been able to accomplish with these. And that's really it for the slideshow. So let's go ahead and get into the program. So ultimately, we're going to be starting off here with the pre-sync stuff. And there's just a few notes here, but they're really important. So if you haven't gone through the sync tool yet, or maybe you're struggling a lot with the sync tool, maybe you guys need to just go back to the starting line and go through these tips to make sure that you guys have addressed everything that you need to. So pre-sync, meaning before you actually start sending information back and forth between the two programs, we want to discuss a couple of the things to keep in mind. Number one, and this comes up a lot, especially for new users. So if you guys are new out there, or you're just attempting to start billing out of OfficeTools and you want to connect it to your QuickBooks file, number one tip here, as far as this is concerned, is that this is not meant to be used for beginning balance transfers. Okay, a lot of people do that. They get in there, they start importing stuff in, or they start exporting stuff out, and they realize very quickly that that's not what this is for. If you guys are just getting started with the QuickBooks Sync, you guys want to make sure that you understand that. It's going to be better for you to plug in your AR balances directly into OfficeTools, maybe from an aging report out of QuickBooks, before you start syncing information over. So this is not meant to be a beginning balance transfer. Jennifer, should I start brand new QuickBooks for syncing? If you mean QuickBooks file, that's up to you. We don't require you to create a new file. In most cases, we would probably say that it's not needed. But if you would feel more comfortable with starting a new QuickBooks file for this purposes, then that's fine. And I think you'll find as we go through that there is flexibility. So if you want to keep your current QuickBooks file, you don't need to create a new one. You're going to kind of figure that out as we go through this pre-sync information. Okay. So matching your work codes identically to service items is not necessary. You just need to link them. That's tip number two. So inside of OfficeTools, you have work codes. Inside of QuickBooks, you have service items, and those two things should just be linked up. Okay. So we have Michael says, what does this tool sync with? So the QuickBooks Sync is meant to sync billing information because QuickBooks is a billing/general ledger software. So most directly, we're talking invoices and payments. That's what we're syncing here. If you're a little bit farther along, you might have contact information. There's a very few amount of people that sync time, but that's basically what we're doing here. Contact info, time cards, what you're tracking inside of OfficeTools, invoices and payments. That's what's being synced between the two softwares, with an emphasis on the last two, being invoices and payments. So, like I was saying, matching your work codes here identically is not necessary. You don't need to replicate your service code list in OfficeTools or your work code list in QuickBooks. You can just link them together. And what that means is that when you're looking at your two lists, and inside of OfficeTools, mine happens to be exactly the same. But if you go in here under work codes, you're going to be linking these up. And that's so that the two programs can talk to each other. There's little bridges that are made so that when we push information over, it knows where to push that information into QuickBooks. Because obviously, if you guys haven't been around OfficeTools very long, you want to start from OfficeTools as much as you can. All of our syncs are designed to work most efficiently, pushing information from OfficeTools to QuickBooks, or from OfficeTools to Assert, or from OfficeTools to Outlook. It's not really meant to bring it the other way. So keep that in mind in this process. We're working off the assumption that you're going to be moving information from OfficeTools to QuickBooks. And Michael, on screen is a little bit of what we do here. If you look at your time and billing, we sync invoices, we sync payments, we sync time cards. That's really what it's for. And then obviously the contact information. Yeah. So part of your process, if you're brand new and setting this up, is going to be to go through each of these things and do this option here that says match/synchronize. And this will allow you to connect and make those little bridges that I was talking about. That's honestly the number one problem. When you guys are running syncs and you're giving us a call, you're calling support, and you're getting these little errors that say object is not set to a reference or some version of that, that typically means that everything has not been connected yet. And so part of your initial process is going to be to go through and match all these things up. And that includes contacts, employees, work codes, and expense codes. Employees are not as necessary, but definitely contacts, work codes, and expense codes. You have to have those linked up in order for them to work. Which means that yes, in the fact that some people have QuickBooks files that don't have their clients in there. If you're going to plan on using the sync tool in QuickBooks, you will have to have your contacts individual entries inside of your customer center of QuickBooks. You can't have just nothing in there. We do require that it's sent over under a client. Okay, so you at least need one. Work codes, expense codes, we were talking about that. Again, you don't need identical lists. If you already have a QuickBooks file that you're running, you already have service items, you already have expense items, you're just going to link those to the work codes or expense codes you have in OfficeTools. And when we're talking about that, when we look at this, let's just say we go into match/synchronize. This is kind of what it will look like. On the left-hand side of your screen, once it loads up, will be your OfficeTools information. On the right-hand side of your screen will be all of your QuickBooks. So when we looked up the work codes, which is what we have here, your work codes are here, and your service items from QuickBooks are here. So the idea is that you would link these together by clicking on them and then choosing link, and that matches them together. So inside of this section, you will need to go to Setup, QuickBooks, and then Work Codes, Expense Codes, Contacts, Match/Synchronize. And the point of this, again, mine happened to be pretty close because I exported it into QuickBooks directly. But if you don't, if this list is completely different, your QuickBooks list is completely different from your OfficeTools list, all you need to do is just pick the codes that go together. Okay? And you can have more than one work code in OfficeTools linked to the same service item in QuickBooks. You don't need the granular details that you might have in OfficeTools on your general ledger. If you just have a tax service item, for example, and you don't want it to be broken down by 1040, 1120, T1, T2, whatever it might be, you can link all of your tax codes in OfficeTools to your one service item for tax inside of QuickBooks. So however your QuickBooks file exists, you don't need to change it to have the sync tool work. You just need to make sure that things are lined up appropriately. Okay, so that's what we were talking about when we talked about creating a new QuickBooks file. We don't necessarily need to do that. We just need to make sure that all of our bridges, everything that we're matching together, actually goes together. And it's okay if it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. If I don't have all of my work codes inside of QuickBooks, that's fine. Just link the codes to the proper service item or items. So keep that in mind. This isn't meant to just totally blow up your QuickBooks file. We're just trying to help you get information over. All right. And you're going to do this same process, right? Financial planning, link. This is a common concept between, again, your contacts, work codes, and expense codes. You can see I'm emphasizing that because normally when something's going wrong, one of those things is not linked up. So we're going to move on to the next point here, which is that when building your certificate. So those of you guys who have either gone through this already or are brand new, when you first connect your QuickBooks file to OfficeTools, QuickBooks requires a certificate to allow OfficeTools access to that file. Excuse me. There's a couple options at the bottom of the certificate that ask kind of how you want this file to be able to open QuickBooks. And typically we say whenever the QuickBooks file is open. So one thing to remember, if you guys haven't figured it out yet, or again, if you're brand new, is that in order for the sync tool to work, the QuickBooks file that you're linked to, your company QuickBooks file, needs to be open on that workstation. So if I, Brandon, am wanting to send something over to QuickBooks, I have to have the QuickBooks file open on my computer. Okay. So a lot of people don't know that. They think if it's open anywhere that gives access to the OfficeTools to sync, and that's not true. The QuickBooks file has to be open on the machine that is actually being or is actually running the sync itself. Okay, so that's a really important part of this. Now, that being said, inside that certificate, you'll notice that there is an option to allow OfficeTools to open QuickBooks based on a specific user license. So if you have an extra license, which most people don't, but if you have one, you can designate that for OfficeTools to open QuickBooks with, and then anytime the QuickBooks sync is started up, it'll open QuickBooks automatically. So keep in mind that that's QuickBooks rules, not really OfficeTools rules, but just to kind of understand how they connect. When you build your certificate, you do have a couple options, but as long as you understand that we can't access that QuickBooks file because it's an actual file that's locked down with passwords, unless it is open. That's the only way that we're able to gain access to the actual file itself. Michael asked the questions, if we have a QuickBooks file that is rather old and was not linked to anywhere else, is it better to possibly open a new QuickBooks file at the beginning of the year and push the sync? That is completely up to you, Michael. We've kind of discussed that a little bit already. I see that you were a little bit late. That's okay. It is up to you. We don't need you to, but if you would feel more comfortable with a nice clean slate, then absolutely. There's going to be no harm that's done by creating a new QuickBooks file. And in some instances, it may be a little bit better if you do have an older file, maybe that's kind of muddied up or something like that, and you want to start fresh. That's completely fine with us. But there is no preference, and there's not really a best practice. If you're comfortable with your QuickBooks file the way it is, link up to that. If you would like to maybe take an opportunity to update that file into the new file, then go for it. Either way, we'll be able to link. You just have to match everything up. Okay? So the last thing is that contacts should be manually linked to ensure proper linking. This is a big thing. So back in that setup that we were just in, if we go to QuickBooks, which is where you're going to access your settings here, there's this option called contacts. And if we go to match/synchronize, this opens up a big list. And depending upon the size of your guys' office, this can get pretty long, right? You could have a contact list that is pretty extensive. But for the sake of your billing, for the sake of your general ledger, our best practice here is pretty straightforward. When you're connecting, if you already have your contact list inside of QuickBooks and you already have your contact list inside of OfficeTools, they're going to be on the left and the right, right? Same as the work code list. Here's your OfficeTools, here's your QuickBooks. You'll notice in here that there is an auto match. Okay? Now, that's great, but I, and most of our training team would probably agree with me, don't recommend that you do the auto match, simply because that's relying on a software to know when things need to be linked. And you know, and I know, and everybody knows that ever has a QuickBooks file, that it simply isn't the case that everything is always perfect. So what that means is that it is our recommendation, though it will be kind of time consuming and maybe a little bit painful, to go through and actually connect your contacts together manually. That's why we have interns, right? That's why we hire them in the first place, is to go through and do these types of things that we don't want to do, right? Or whatever it might be, we need you to get this done in a way that makes sure that you have the proper things linked. Because the last thing that you want to do in here is have things being crossed and then things not showing up in QuickBooks the way you think they should, balances getting skewed, and everything becoming a problem, right? And then you're going to blame the OfficeTools sync. But in all reality, we can avoid all of those problems by making sure that the contacts are connected up. Okay. Dennis, great question. I was going to put that towards the end. We do not currently link with classes. Okay. So anything that you have in the class system, we cannot link with. QuickBooks, when we built our sync, did not allow us access to that field. All right. We are working on it. That is something that is asked very frequently, but at this moment in time, we do not have access to the classes. All right. So to give you a little bit of a rundown, so we've kind of gone through the setup of the sync. You know how to match it. You know how to do your matching for context, work codes, and expense codes. Once you've matched everything, the sync becomes immensely less difficult. As long as all of your matching is done correctly, we don't really have much problem. Okay, so let's go ahead and build an invoice and then send it to QuickBooks. How do we do that? What's the process? Now that I've linked everything up, how to actually use this thing? Here's how it's going to work. So let's just say we're on this contact here. We're on the billing tab, and then we're on the invoices button over here. I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a brand new invoice. Just from scratch. I'm not building it from time or anything. I'm just building a invoice off the bat here. Okay. We're going to say it's $100. We're going to move that to final. We're going to close that down. And that's all we did. Just created a new invoice that we want to sync over. So how do you actually sync it? So inside of the billing tab, under the invoices button, there is a QuickBooks button that's located right here. This is how you access the sync itself. When you open this up, this is going to show you any invoice that has not been synced to QuickBooks yet. This window, when you click on the QuickBooks button at the top, is not client specific. So even though we're on Adams Haley here, if we click on this QuickBooks button and it opens up this window, any invoice that we have that has not been synced to QuickBooks yet will be inside of this window. So you'll be able to, at the end of the day or at the end of the week, whatever you guys end up wanting to do, send over all of your invoices at one time. You don't have to do it after every single invoice. You don't have to go client by client. You can just go right into that QuickBooks button, open the sync tool up, and send over any invoice that you've created since the last time you did your sync. So in this case, you can, if you have a ton, if you have like 50 invoices in here that you're looking to send and you can see your number right there in the top, then you can just hit select all. If you're not sure about some, because maybe you still want to go back through them and make sure that they're right, you can always manually check your box on the far right. A lot of people try to check the exported box. That's not going to work. That means it's already been exported, right? The check box, right? The check mark box right beneath that, that's what's controlling whether you're sending it to QuickBooks or not. Okay? So if you don't want to sync this invoice, you can uncheck it. If you just want to sync this invoice, you can check it. You guys get the picture. And then we hit export selected. This will run for a second. As long as we don't have any errors, right, it'll just pop up and say completed. Now, I was having a little bit of trouble with this earlier because my connection seems a little broken to my QuickBooks file. So hopefully this just runs for me and I don't have to close it down. Because you all know on webinars, programs try to give you problems. And it looks like it's going to give me problems. That's exactly what you want to see. Give it a few more seconds here. All right, well, that's definitely not what you want. We do not get supplied with the newest versions of QuickBooks, just as an FYI. So I'm trying to link to a 2014 QuickBooks, which is probably why I'm having issues here. I apologize for the snag. Let me just close this down real fast. I had tested it out a couple times and it had worked for me, but it was being a little touchy. So let me just open up our OfficeTools program one more time here. There we go. Okay. So you'll see that QuickBooks button on both the Invoice tab and the Payments tab. So you're going to follow the same process regardless of whether you're doing invoices or whether you're doing payments. So it's not going to be based on the difference between what you're sending. It's going to be the very similar process between the two. So you'll notice you have your QuickBooks button right here under the invoices area, and you also have your QuickBooks button right here under your payments area. So just bear with me here. We're going to try this one more time. We're going to hit select all, and then we're going to go ahead and export. And it should pop up pretty fast for us. There we go. So now it says complete, which means that it's now in QuickBooks. So you'll see that that empties out your invoices inside of the QuickBooks integration area. So if you click on that button again, you'll notice there's nothing there. This will not show you synced invoices. This is only going to show you the ones that have not been synced yet. Okay. So at that point, if we pull down our QuickBooks file here, which is our fake 2014 accountant version, you'll notice that that $100 invoice has been pushed over into OfficeTools, or into QuickBooks, I apologize. And that's really all there is to it. So now if we go back through, and let's just say we have a payment for that invoice. And if you guys haven't gone through a billing training to know all of these things yet, then I definitely recommend that. But we track our payment, and then we go to QuickBooks. We'll see those payments, whatever we have in there. I'm just going to send this one over, and then we're going to go to export. And hopefully this one works just as well as the last one. Not yet. All right. So that has to do with a deposit account. I don't have my undeposited funds set up, so that's why that didn't work. So your payments, which brings up to the next great point. Your payments, when you use the QuickBooks sync, they like to go into QuickBooks as individual lines, meaning you're not doing deposits. So anybody that does deposit slips inside of OfficeTools, those do not sync over. So if you're planning on doing deposit slips, right, they're actually what you're taking to the bank from QuickBooks, then the only reason to really do them in OfficeTools would be to reconcile. Okay, but each of your payments are going to go into undeposited funds inside of QuickBooks. That way you can build your own deposit and it hits your bank in one transaction instead of something different where it hits your bank account in each individual payment amount. Okay. So what do I mean? What am I talking about when I'm saying undeposited funds? What am I talking about when I'm saying that? Part of your setup process, which I like to show a little bit about how the sync works before I go into this piece, is something called accounts defaults. That is very important when you're setting up your sync to make sure that everything is being pushed to the right spot. So if I go into the setup menu and I go to QuickBooks, you'll see this section called accounts defaults. It's the number one thing at the top. Okay. If you see general ledger in there, we are not currently linked up to that. You'll see it's grayed out. It won't do anything yet. We're building a little bit more capability inside of there, but right now that's not something that's live. But accounts defaults allows you to choose where all of your pieces are going to go, including your AR, AP, all that kind of stuff will be linked inside of here. Okay. So you can see your accounts payable, what account is that supposed to go to? Your deposit bank account, where do you want your payments sent to? All right, we chose undeposited funds. Accounts receivable, where is your invoices going to? What account are these being applied to? And then payroll, if you guys are sending payroll, which we do not recommend, just as a kind of a precursor there, we do not recommend that you're sending over time. Okay. Just as a reminder for anybody that's been added here, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the questions area. We're just going through, we're answering them as we go here. Okay. So those are your accounts. That's making sure that when you send information over to QuickBooks, it's going to the right spot. Your AR is going to your AR, your payments are going to the proper account. Ideally, that's undeposited funds and all of that. Debit memos are considered payments. They'll go over, though, as invoices into the program, although in most cases, we would probably not recommend that you send them over. All right. But they'll go in as invoices. Okay. And then on the right, this is probably the most important piece of the entire sync. It has to do with the default line item settings that you have, including your summary line item, expense item, mileage item, discount item, and late fees. These things need to be linked to the appropriate lines that you expect things to go over as a default. The number one tip that I'm going to give you, because we're about 5 minutes left, all right? The number one tip that I'm going to give you guys right now is that if you're using invoice types other than work code or project inside of OfficeTools, okay? Work code or project style invoices inside of OfficeTools, whatever you have in your summary line item is going to be how it's pushed into QuickBooks. If you're using a summary style invoice, if you're using a staff style invoice, if you're using a date style invoice, if you're using a custom style invoice, any invoice type that you're using outside of work code or project, when it pushes into QuickBooks, it is going to use this item. So if you guys are using QuickBooks and you're wondering, why is it always going to this one line item no matter what I do? It doesn't matter on your invoice. If you have 8 lines, 8 line items for 8 different services, if you're using a custom style invoice or you're using a date style or a staff style, we don't push the time over with the invoice. So all it's connecting to is either the work code or the project that you're listing to. Then we can get into the correct service items. If not, it is going to go to your default service item that you have listed right here. Okay? Very important. A lot of people don't understand that, and a lot of people aren't told that in certain instances in the sessions. So make sure that you understand that. Any invoice type outside of work code and project, you will get this line. Okay. So what does that mean? It means use work code and project style invoices and everything will push over correctly. All right. Just keep that in mind. So we're getting towards the end here of the post-sync stuff that I want to bring up. When it comes down to that, there's one major thing that I want to bring up about the invoices when it really boils down. Number one is that the invoice itself, when it pushes over, it doesn't always take the descriptions. If you're not pushing over the invoice with the proper type of invoice that we just talked about, then it's going to pull the description from the line item that you have in QuickBooks. Okay? So it's not replicating your invoices between OfficeTools and QuickBooks. The point of sending the invoice to QuickBooks isn't so that it's a duplicate. It's just so that your general ledger stays up to date. Okay? It's not to make sure that you have a replicated invoice over there in QuickBooks. What we're most worried about is getting your totals from OfficeTools to QuickBooks to make sure that your general ledger is up to date and accurate. Okay? And the second thing, which actually a lot of people ask me about, call us about, is that the invoices, once you export them to QuickBooks, one major thing to note is that they're not connected. It is not a true sync tool. It is an export tool. So if you go back into OfficeTools and you write up that invoice or write it down or discount it or whatever you do, you will have to make that action in QuickBooks as well. They're not going to stay connected. This is not a sync tool as much as it is an export tool. Okay, so keep that in mind. A lot of people call and ask. They say, well, my AR numbers aren't matching. I changed this invoice. It's not matched up to this invoice anymore. If you write an invoice up or write it down after you've exported it to QuickBooks, you will have to adjust it. Okay. In our last minute, we have a couple questions that haven't been answered. What if you have more than one bank account in QuickBooks to deposit to? That's kind of why we push it to undeposited funds. That way you can handle the payments in the same way that you always have. We do not have the capability currently of pushing payments to more than one account. It can only go to one, which is why undeposited funds is what we recommend, so that way you can control where it goes from there. Okay, Lisa? Dennis, can I sync payments if I don't sync invoices? Absolutely. It is not a mutually exclusive sync tool there. If you're not doing invoices over to QuickBooks, that's fine. You can still do your payments over to QuickBooks as well. That's nothing that there's going to be no issue that arises from that as long as your AR exists in both spots. Obviously, it would be kind of odd if you're doing payments only inside of OfficeTools and not invoices. But if you're just not syncing your invoices to QuickBooks, that's fine too. Connect everything together. But we would highly recommend connecting, making sure that both have both. Last question before we end. So if we're wanting to use QuickBooks for credit card payments, we'd still have to log it into OT manually. If you're using Intuit's merchant services and you're collecting credit card payments inside of there, that's fine. The QuickBooks sync is not technically just from OfficeTools to QuickBooks. If you go to your time and billing, Yamila, you can see inside of here that you can also import payments from QuickBooks. So the credit card stuff that you're getting inside of QuickBooks from Intuit Merchant Services, you can import right into OfficeTools. You will still have to apply that payment to the invoice. It's not going to auto-apply for you, but you can import them from QuickBooks if you're running those merchant services. All right, guys. So thank you guys very much. If any additional questions arise or we didn't get to the question maybe that you had in your mind, please email us, training@officetools.com. We're always available to you, and we'll make sure to get back to you as soon as we can. Again, thanks for joining this webinar, and take a look at our upcoming schedule. There's going to be some changes, and I'm excited for you guys. So take a look at that. Again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time.